guessing myself. I had to really consider what I was asking of myself and of other people through the Home Office's systems. Welcome to the Longest Day podcast. I'm Leah Brown FRSA, your host. Usually on this podcast, you get to eavesdrop on my conversations with leaders about their things barely shared on social media, their toughest, longest days and seasons of their journey. But today, I'm being interviewed on my own podcast, which I have to say feels pretty weird. I would like to welcome the inimitable Dr. Farrah Jarrell, who is more than up to this task. She's a writer, radio broadcaster, and GP based in London. She's currently working on a non-fiction book, Anima, exploring the idea of the soul from anthropological, scientific, and historical perspectives, which will be published by Picador in the UK and Pantheon in the US. She's represented by Tracy Bohan at the Wiley Agency and is perhaps best known for writing and presenting the acclaimed 10-part BBC Radio 4 series Savage to Self, which charted the evolution of anthropology and its impact on wider society.
Thank you, Leah. Hello and welcome to the Longest Day podcast. Our guest today is Leah Brown herself, the founder and CEO of the Wayfinders Group, transforming organisations through mission-aligned change, conflict resolution and cultural development. A qualified solicitor, accredited mediator and change expert with a philosophy degree, Leah transforms challenging workplaces using conflict resolution techniques, helping leaders identify systemic issues, rebuild fractured teams, and implement sustainable governance reforms. Leah is spearheading a coalition on institutional accountability. She's also a professional speaker, lecturer, and mind ambassador. She's an agented writer represented by Hannah Wetherill at Watson Little, an accomplished violinist, and a person of faith, based in Broadstairs, East Kent. Leah, why don't you give our listeners an overview of your longest day?
My longest day was the 9th of January 2009. I've been eating my parents' the breakfast in North London. I got on the bus. I opened a letter that had arrived in the post that morning from the UK Border Agency, only to find out that I had 7 days to appeal or 28 days to leave the United Kingdom.
Tell me more about that.
Well, thank you for asking. Okay, so to zoom out, I grew up in North Yorkshire. I had recently graduated from university and I was on a student visa. And I did what any minor graduate would do in 2008, knowing the job market was what it was, and I was trying to find work. I had received an offer to start a ministry training scheme in North London, and I was therefore going to apply for a post-study work visa. And I was legally entitled to this visa. I'd been accepted to law school to do my graduate diploma in law, and I had decided to defer my place in favour of going to work for this church. To say I was pretty indignant about receiving this letter would be a huge understatement. I mean, when you think that you've finally worked out how you're going to progress your future, and then you're thwarted by something that you genuinely thought you were entitled to receive, and not just thwarted, but suddenly ripped out of your environment, everything that you know, everything that you have, and you suddenly got to figure out, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I decided that I wasn't going to fight that battle. All I was going to do was try and work out how I could, once I'd left the UK, get back to the UK and get my life back on track to be able to progress my career as a lawyer. But yes, I think the whole experience left me astounded. It left me quite jaded. And to be honest, my longest day was a season that didn't get resolved until 2016 when I received my UK passport.
Can you tell listeners a little bit about your background and how you came to be in this situation?
Absolutely. So, as I said, I grew up in North Yorkshire. I have a younger brother and 2 parents. And when I was 12, my family moved to the US. My dad was working in intelligence at the time. I didn't know that, but that was why we were relocating to the United States. Being a teenager is never really a good time to relocate. So I had a really difficult year as a freshman in high school until I found myself back in England, finishing out the school year to try and find a bit of normalcy after a lot of upheaval. And I stayed in the US for the rest of my high school, my parents actually sent me to university when I was 13, so I was doing high school and university at the same time. But long story short, when I graduated, I was really keen to come back to the UK. And as it happened, I was planning to go to university and I found myself at a boarding school on a music scholarship. But that is a different longest day for another podcast. The long and short of it is I had a passport from Barbados because my grandfather and my mother were from there, so I obtained it by descent. And my mother had secured an academic visa for me whilst I was under the age of 18 to be able to come to the UK and be able to come and go as I pleased until I turned 18 and finished my school. So by the time I got to university on a student visa, I was very, very concerned, like many students are, about, well, what do you do if you're a foreign worker and you're trying to find employment? And lots of law firms had basically said, look, the recession is impending and we don't know how many spaces we're going to have. And eventually there was an entire moratorium on hiring law firm graduates from overseas. So I took this job working for this church to give myself a little bit more time to figure that out. But also my family was unraveling and my parents were in the process of starting to think about getting divorced. And it wasn't a good time to be progressing my career. So to answer your original question, I'd instructed a firm of solicitors to help me with the application. I was 21. I didn't know what I didn't know. I recognized that I probably needed to be navigated through that process. And I was completely transparent about the course of study, the confirmation, the funds that I'd paid over to secure my place, where I was working, what tax I was paying, pay slips, all of that kind of thing. And so I had never had a question in my mind about my eligibility for this particular visa until that morning when I got that letter.
Sure. So you were really entrenched in your London life with no inkling that things could go so badly wrong until you received this bombshell. Where did you go? Who did you turn to at this time?
Yes, I think one of the things that really stood out to me at that time was that I was surrounded by people who did not understand what I was going through. So part of that is having gone to a public school. Part of that is my parents didn't really understand how to navigate the system because they had never had to. I found myself on a plane to Barbados, which logically makes sense because that is the passport in which my visa was, and that was where I needed to go to apply for a successive visa to come back. But my family didn't live there. My family, my nuclear family lived in the US, and my brother was still in the UK. And so I found myself living with a family member, the wonderful Sir Philip Greaves, KA QC, who was Deputy Prime Minister of Barbados and went on to be Governor General. And I hope he gets a chance to listen to this episode. And he took me in. I thought I'd be there a week. And then I found myself marooned on this 166 square mile island for much longer than I felt comfortable. I had great friends. He tried to understand. I had a friend from the US who came on holiday. She was very pregnant and we spent time traveling the island. I had a friend who called me on Skype every week to make sure that I was okay. I had friends who would text me regularly. I passed a lot of the time in solitude and genuinely think that the entire church community thought that I was spending every day on the beach drinking. Yeah, a lot of it. But I really wasn't. I mean, as soon as I landed, the first stop was to go to submit a further visa application. And in 6 weeks, I had 3 further refusals. So it's quite a dispiriting time. And in the background, as I mentioned, with my parents' divorce, my grandfather got sick. And subsequently, we ended up planning his funeral. And I had to do the 3-way calls to mediate between my parents. And it was just an incredibly difficult time. And I didn't think at the time that I had the people around me that I needed, but it wasn't the end of the story. And it turns out that I did. And I think whilst I was stranded, I had a lot of time to consider, is this really the career that I want? And what's the fallback plan? And could I take my life in a different direction? And could I be happy if I was marooned on this island for the rest of my life? And it was short-lived because eventually I did get a visa to return to the UK. And I did manage to finish out the year doing an apprenticeship at this church. And I did manage to get a scholarship to study more, and I did manage to take up my course of study. It was still an incredibly challenging time.
It sounds it, certainly. And was there anything in your career or your personal life that prepared you to deal with this administrative onslaught, this incredible hurdle in your life?
I've had then be multiple career experiences that have enabled me to do what I do now because I was just 22. But I was very stranger to adversity. I was not a stranger to things not going my way. And I was definitely not a stranger to having to figure out things for myself. I think for me, I got to the point where I started to question whether or not I could follow instructions or whether I had misunderstood the criteria for the visa. I scrutinized the requirements. I made sure that everything that I thought that I was entitled to and had applied for, even though I was second guessing myself, I had to really consider what I was asking of myself and of other people through the Home Office's systems, through very expensive processes that were very challenging and very stressful. But when I considered that I grew up in a chronically dysfunctional, unstable, unpredictable environment, I'd had to learn how to navigate uncertainty just like this. I'd also had to learn to pick myself up. I'd had to learn to comfort myself in the face of disappointment. And I had to learn what it looks like to keep going when there's nothing left in the tank. So, as somebody who learned to override my instincts to survive, I guess you could say that I was in my element. But I was also super connected to my spiritual life. I think I probably had as many questions for God as I did for the Home Office. But I had people who had much more life experience than I did, reminding me that this was not the end. And these people who knew my potential were not going to let this be the end of my story. But ultimately, I knew that what I was trying to do wasn't just going to benefit me, right? It wasn't just about me. It was about the people that I would eventually bring with me and eventually be able to encourage through awful and difficult and challenging situations. So I think I'd learned to look for hope in unexpected places, and I definitely found that while I was in Barbados.
You're listening to the Longest Day podcast with Leah Brown FRSA. We'll be back right after a short ad break. Let's continue with Leah where we left off. Leah, with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done anything different?
The memoirist in me takes hindsight quite carefully. During the pandemic, when I was working as a general counsel, all hours of all days when lots of people were on furlough and watching Netflix, I wrote my first memoir, and I had to reconsider this story, not just my memories of experiencing it at the time, but also in my reflections on it when I was writing about it, and then my further observations when I was deconstructing it from an editorial perspective. I think, looking back, there was so much turmoil because I didn't trust my instincts. I mean, to be honest, I didn't really know how to, but it's not surprising that as a 22-year-old, you don't trust your own instincts. I think the most frustrating thing about my longest day is that it didn't need to happen. So I'd been to the law firm's office in Mayfair on a recommendation from a close friend, and I sat with the solicitor and I challenged her and I said, I don't feel like you're answering the questions that I'm asking you, and I'm asking for greater technicality given my particular circumstances. I'm not a kind of a standard applicant for these visas, and I need to understand what my path is to indefinite leave to remain. And I wasn't getting the answers from her that I needed, and deep down I knew that I didn't really rate this individual. But as I say, I was 21 at the time, and I didn't know what I didn't know, and this person, well, certainly the firm, had been recommended to me, and therefore I just went with it. But if I knew then what I knew now, I would have believed that this person was not a good lawyer, who really should have been struck off. And I would have stood up for myself. And in practice, what that would have looked like is understanding that the issue was never with my application. There was nothing wrong with my application. the lawyer didn't advocate for me and didn't complete the forms properly. And therefore, all I needed to do in this situation was spend the time and the money and the effort doing the appeal. And the fact that I defaulted to okay, I need to leave the country because that will then solidify my ability to come back. I just wish that I had advocated for myself. Now, it is worth saying that this visa, 6 months later, was overturned. Took 2 appeals, and it took the partners at that law firm advocating on my behalf for what I should have been entitled for from the outset. But it did get overturned. And I think that affirmed my conviction that I wasn't in the wrong for making these applications. I think it's important to give yourself grace. I don't kick myself because I didn't know better then, but boy, do I know better now. I think I would have challenged the system. I think it was a ridiculous administrative error that was unnecessary. And I didn't have the people around me with the context that I needed to be able to guide me into having the confidence that if I did fight this, that something would come of it. And that, I think, is probably one of my greater regrets.
And it's interesting that you had such a challenge with all of this, despite being a highly intelligent, assertive person with access to legal support. So people who don't even have that are in serious trouble.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, navigating the immigration system is unwieldy at best, and extortionately expensive at worst. And I've heard and seen so many people go through so much worse than I experienced. I mean, look, I'm here. I'm in England to tell the tale. I've got a British passport. The whole tale is very much kind of a footnote on my bigger story. But I have a huge amount of empathy for people who are navigating this, and the unfairness of the system, the number of people that somehow manage to fall through the cracks. And I didn't make my legal practice immigration. It was too painful for me. I found it too infuriating. But I do think it's really important to help maybe one person who is going through something like this to say that it is possible to navigate the system and survive. So that is my testimony.
And how do you think your longest day, or rather your longest painful season, has informed what you're doing now?
Well, for those who don't know, I run the Wayfinders Group. So we are working in a variety of forums to bring about reconciliation and transformation to leaders in the UK. And through a multidisciplinary approach, so that might be mediation, behavioral science, law, philosophy, conflict resolution, more generally, crisis management, you see a lot of people in their worst moments. And one of the things about working with people when they're in the afters is that you get to see lots of people rising like phoenixes. And I've seen situations and people completely broken, but I've also seen people and situations completely transformed. And seeing the impossible happen is one of the greatest privileges of my career. I personally work as a mediator as part of my work at Wayfinders, holding space for people to bring the fullness of themselves and work out what it looks like for them to have an effective conversation and to be the best version of themselves. Part of that is helping them rebuild trust when that has broken down. And I do that on an individual level or on a collective level. So me and some of the directors of Wayfinders went to South Africa in October 2024 to work with NGO leaders in the townships and with lawyers in the court systems to teach them effective restorative justice processes. So when I got to see civil society resorting to vigilante justice, and I saw the existence of restorative processes sitting alongside that to address some of the challenges in obtaining justice, when I came back to the UK, I saw our system and our challenges and our constant commitment to reform. And I thought, I run a problem-solving consultancy and we do things differently. And I think there might be a different solution here. And I started thinking about it. So when we hear Britain is broken and things continue to be on the steady decline, we started to examine the relationship between police and the people that they serve, the courts and the people that they serve, the hospitals and the people that they serve. And so we realized very quickly that public trust is a problem. And so if we rebuild trust, what if we change the forum in which we were trying to operate and focused on how we could help Britain's publicly funded institutions rebuild trust with the public, and what would it look like to commit to a programme of repair rather than reform. So what is Wayfinders doing at the moment? We are about to publish a long-form political white paper entitled From Harm to Healing, Rebuilding Trust in Britain's Publicly Funded Institutions, which we hope to publish by the end of June 2025.
Sounds like a fascinating and much needed piece of work. Can you tell us a bit more about this white paper?
Yes, of course. I mean, I can't stop thinking about it because it's been in the background of every day for the last 9 months. But it's a long-form research paper with prestigious contributors and institutional partnerships. So this Right to Equality and the Restorative Justice Council and Impress, the UK's publishing regulator, as well as a number of barristers and esteemed practitioners in the criminal justice system. We've examined the status quo. We've also spoken to journalists and advocates and broadcasters and survivors to design a blueprint for institutional transformation. So, quick summary, looking at the Home Office, for example, who's responsible for Grenfell. They're responsible for countless judicial reviews, public inquiries, police spending, Windrush. All of these things we have examined through case studies in the report. They're even responsible for the Kent Coast migrant response situations. So we've looked at them as a government department, but also others, and recognise that there are similar trends across all of the publicly funded institutions where trust is steadily declining. So I think one of the things about this white paper is not that it's just about informing public consciousness. It's about what do you do with the figures that we've learned, with the blueprint that we've created, so what and what next? So the purpose of this white paper is effectively to launch a coalition for institutional accountability, and that will be working to do the recommendations in the white paper. The first of which is to legislate for a restorative framework throughout publicly funded institutions. And the second is to create an independent office for institutional accountability that has survivors' voice at the centre of it. And then the third is to invest in leadership development and training in a way that embeds restorative approaches through HR and the working environment. And so the hope is that we'll commit to kind of a 10-year plan to transform Britain's publicly funded institutions. And look, Wayfinders is a change management consultancy. We're a catalyst for change. We help people navigate this uncharted territory and thrive. And so it's been a real privilege, I think, to see the data required for bringing about real change, but to be so well supported by activists and advocates and policy experts and campaigners and MPs and peers, and to just be propelled to keep going in that fight to bring about change. And I guess that's quite similar to my personal story, right? So by Farrah Jarrell, I kind of wasn't gonna give up. And I don't believe in luck. I believe in God's grace because that is my faith conviction. But I think there is something about that tenacity needed in a piece of work like this, because this isn't a one and done. This isn't okay, we've assessed the financials and here's the new matrix for how we're going to transform Britain, and then we just plug in all these things and then here's the output. It's a relational work, and that means that it is slow and that there's going to be a lot more disappointment before we see progress. But actually, if we have planned out that impact and if we're really committed to the cause, I think there's a huge amount of work we can achieve.
Well, best of luck to you, although not luck, God's grace, I suppose. So just to finish with the classic longest day question, if you had to go back in time and relive your longest day, what would you fuel yourself with? What would be on the menu for you, Leah?
This is such a tricky question, and I really don't envy the participants who I put in this chair every week. I suppose I'd need something that sustains me, but if I'm completely honest, I think I would just want to have something that brings me joy. I love champagne, and I just think that there's nothing quite like a really crisp, cold bottle of champagne to enjoy with a friend, possibly on a roof terrace, possibly even in a picnic in St James's Park, with some I don't know, snack food probably from Waitrose. And I think to take an opportunity whilst drinking that to acknowledge how much I have, because even in my longest day, I wasn't without grace. I had somewhere to live. I had money in the account. My church was still paying me even though I was not working there. I had everything that I needed to step into the future that I was desperate to create. And so I think that idea of stopping and celebrating, I know it's not strictly food. And if you ask me what my favorite food is, it is always going to be scallops of some variation. But you can't really have those on the go, and you'd have to be sitting down at a restaurant, and you don't really want my full memory. So my full menu. So I think I would just have to say snack food that I could accompany with a really great glass of champagne.
Sounds delicious and refreshing. Thank you so much, Leah, for being a guest on your own podcast. It's been fascinating. It's been inspiring. And I think what strikes me most about your story is how you've transformed what could have been a narrative of victimhood and which was incredibly painful, being marooned essentially for a long period of time, into one of profound purpose. Your longest day has become the catalyst for work that's now hopefully helping to rebuild trust in British institutions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on my own podcast. It's been an absolute joy to be here. You've been listening to the Longest Day podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do engage with us on social media, and why not leave us a review? Tune in soon to hear the next installment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2025. Production copyright Leah Talks Limited. All rights reserved.